There's a song that I've never been able to track down, but there's an old song that people used to play around campfires during mountaintop removal protesting. And the main refrain is that these hills are the most beautiful place in the world, and I believe that pretty strongly. Local, state, and national representatives, first of all, should get to know the Clear Fork Valley and places like it a lot better. I think by and large, elected officials have passed over this area and a lot of rural areas like it. And largely, if I'm being honest, I believe that elected officials don't think that these areas matter. So I think that one thing elected officials should know is that there's a number of people who live in these areas and want to keep living in these areas. And they should seriously consider massive investments in public works and public infrastructure. Right now, the Clear Fork Valley in particular, but across rural Appalachia, these areas have witnessed massive disinvestment. I would argue 50 years of disinvestment, if not longer. My name is Gabe Schwartzman. I'm a member of SOCM, as well as a board member of SOCM. I've been doing some work both as a volunteer and then as a researcher in the Clear Fork Valley in Tennessee. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and that's where I'm doing my research. One of the things I really love about the Clear Fork Valley is the amount of community organizing, the amount of energy, and the amount of institutions that are there, and just kind of the amount of community power that's in that area. I volunteer with SOCM, and that's also brought me to be volunteering in the Clear Fork Valley, working with several groups up there, including the Woodland Community Land Trust and the Clear Fork Community Institute, figuring out what folks in the community want to do, whether that's about environmental issues or just even basic community development and even economic development. And I'm just kind of there to help folks, whatever they want to do, support that. My research pairs with that because my research is about economic development in the region. I've been lucky enough that folks in the Clear Fork Valley have kind of taken me on to show me what their versions of community and economic development might look like if it was based from a community standpoint. And I think together I've been working with some of the leaders in the community, and then also we have a youth program this summer, for example, just spending time with young people to figure out what they want to see in the community. And I've been learning a lot, and hopefully there's been a little bit of activism in all of that. Rural parts of Appalachia have seen deeply unfair, if not to say deeply unjust, political and economic outcomes in the last 50 years, if not much longer. My research has been attempting to see a way out of that type of situation. The activism, I would say, is about trying to work with people to create alternatives to the political and economic hole that folks in rural Appalachia have been pigeonholed into. The movement against mountaintop removal and strip mining in the mid-2000s was really the outgrowth of the movement against strip mining in the 70s. And that movement, SOCM, as well as a bunch of other nonprofits, was vitally important in drafting legislation that ended up regulating strip mining, but it didn't end up stopping the practice, which is an extremely devastating practice to, obviously, the land and the people who live near it, and even folks who live far away. Mountaintop removal ended up being the outgrowth of strip mining, taking off entire mountaintops, hundreds of acres of moonscapes left, massive amounts of stream water contamination, and we also say mountaintop removal, but it's a whole series of other practices, including like what you see in Tennessee, massive amounts of environmental devastation and the social devastation that comes with that. And the movement against mountaintop removal, I would say, if you look in the early 2000s, was a resurgence of community action against those environmental damages that were happening in people's backyards. People were getting massive floods, mine wastewater was being pumped into people's well water, as an outgrowth of the processing of mountaintop removal coal. And that movement was vitally important in part because it pressured companies to take actions that I would say have hastened the decline of the coal industry. It cost them money, and it didn't end up in legislative victories necessarily, but it built community power, and it definitely raised the issue across the nation. And it's still going on. Blair, West Virginia is another amazingly special place. Logan County is one of the main sites of the West Virginia Mine Wars. And in 1921, the Battle of Blair Mountain happened just outside of Blair, West Virginia, where 10,000 striking Union miners ended up fighting a armed mercenary army of coal company known at the time as gun thugs. And Blair is a fascinating place because it was not only that site of the West Virginia Mine Wars, but it was also the site of a fair amount of organizing against strip mining in the early 2000s. It was one of the first judgments against a strip mine at the Daltex mine up there. And it's also a place that's really dear to my heart because there was amazing organizing there that I got to take part in the 2012, 2013, right around then. Great people who live there. It's also, I'll also say that place is facing depopulation. In the 70s, there was a fair amount of scholarship and activism that ended up focusing on the question of absentee land ownership, which is that in rural Appalachia, particularly in coal mining areas, but also in kind of any areas of extraction, logging as well, 70 to 90% of the land being owned by corporations not headquartered nearby or even in the region at all. You can trace that back to the settlement of Appalachia by English colonists. There was a series of 3 to 5 land companies that were chartered with British capital that took hold of what we now know to be Appalachia, and in a series of financial transactions that have gone on for several hundred years, those land companies have passed down land holdings and land grants between different land holding and financial entities. Clear Fork Valley is a case that's been highlighted because of some of the stark inequities of the land holding situation. The American company, what was called the American company in the 1890s, ended up with the vast majority of the land, 90% of the land in the area. And they were a British company, they were British capital. And they, despite going bankrupt and reorganizing their financial assets, have effectively maintained that hold on land through the 80s and then broke up into smaller companies. But the dynamic of large financial corporations that are headquartered kind of nowhere, or between New York, London, and everywhere else where the financial capital goes, owns the majority of that land. Now that there's no more coal mining in the Clear Fork Valley, in that transition from mining coal to not mining coal, the Nature Conservancy, which is the largest by wealth environmental organization in the world, has taken on much of those land holdings, if not actually all of them. So now the Nature Conservancy, in actually a private trust called NatureVest, now owns the land that was owned by coal companies previously, which makes them now the large absentee landholder. Nature Conservancy, as a nonprofit, is a majority stakeholder of. It's a venture capital firm, not dissimilar from some of its predecessors, interested in financial gains and making money predominantly from wood products on this land, although they do have a mission for increasing conservation outcomes. In a historical perspective, I think about urban and rural Appalachian politics as having always been operating together. Appalachia doesn't actually really get defined as Appalachia until what we could see as the first wave of post-industrialization in the 19-teens and 20s. If we think of industrialization coming to the mountains in a lot of rural America in the 1890s, there's a massive outpouring of people into the cities after these things like the first wave of coal mining, the massive clear cutting of Appalachia in the 19-teens and even in the 1890s. A bunch of people who've moved, whether from Italy or Alabama, to a place like the Clear Fork Valley, ended up moving to a place like Knoxville. And part of that is because there was massive waves of urbanization that came after industrialization across the board. People from Appalachia ended up bringing Appalachian traditions to the city. We see that in Cabbagetown in Atlanta, all over Knoxville, arguably Nashville is defined by what then was called hillbilly music, is now called country music, of people coming down out of the hills. And there's consistently been a back and forth between the urban politics and rural politics, largely because Appalachia in the recent century has been in the process of deindustrializing, and people have been moving to the nearby cities to bring their culture and politics. In West Virginia, I lived in the Coal River Valley, and I spent some time in Logan County, in Blair, West Virginia in particular, as well as Summers County. And in the Coal River Valley is special because of the amount of community mobilization and power that has gone on there and still resides in that community. That's where Coal River Mountain Watch was started in the late 90s, 2001, where community activists got together to try to stop strip mining and the devastating effects of strip mining in the Coal River Valley. I came to it and came to know the place when I was a teenager, and there was a lot of outside activists coming in to support local activists to oppose mountaintop removal in the area. And that place is just one of, I think, one of the most beautiful places in the world. Some of the strongest, relationships in my life are built there and are there. My favorite musical memory associated with Appalachia. Wow. I think they're all probably ones that I was sitting around playing music with friends. Played music with a few folks in Rock Creek, West Virginia, on the porch of what was then called House 2, in what was called the Ford Edition. It was an organizing camp where people were working to stop mountaintop removal, and myself and Matt Lewis Rosenberg and Jonathan Sidney and Willie Wickham started up a 4-piece band, and it was wonderful. It was some of the best times spent on a porch I can remember. I live in Knoxville. I live in a neighborhood that has quite a bit of poverty, quite a lot of landlords that are seeking evictions despite the fact that we've been in the middle of a pandemic. And because of that, I've gotten involved in some housing justice work. And I think one of the main issues that we want to take on is keeping people in their houses and making sure in the long run that there's affordable houses. A lot of what we've been doing is doing direct action of keeping people in their houses, getting people resources to know that there's a federal moratorium on it, and helping people access those resources. There's also a series of proposals for more access to privately held land in Appalachia. And I think that if there was enough funding for people to live well and people were given more rights to access mountain forest land, I think that you could also see massive transformations in people's lives. Something that people already do, but with more priority given to local people, it could really become where people could really live well. If you look at the Appalachian Regional Commission or any of the development institutions, many of them have not actually prioritized basic quality of life investments, but rather have prioritized a development strategy that involves giveaways to corporations and money for freeways and other transportation infrastructure, which, if you put that together with the large investments in peri-urban areas, what I see is investment in taking people out of rural areas, a lack of investment to help people stay in rural areas, and money to urban areas to keep growing and sprawling in their suburbs. If the federal government does what it should, which is massive public spending in public infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but water system, quality of life questions, childcare, education. If they make that massive investment, Appalachia becomes a place where people can live and live well. That means investing massively in surface mine reclamation, in jobs to deal with abandoned mine lands. That's one of the places that you can see some of the most job growth in the area, and also recreating this amazing forests and ecologies up there. Some of my favorite places in the region and in Appalachia in general probably are all swimming holes. There's an amazing swimming hole on Glade Creek in Raleigh County, West Virginia. Truly, could be like 15 feet, could be 50 feet deep, I don't know. There's a wonderful swimming hole in the Clear Fork Valley on the Laurel Fork. Every community I've known in Appalachia is really populated by people who either grew up there or people who left and came back to find home again. And I think if the federal government can do what it needs to do, which is make that kind of investment, that could fundamentally change the realities of people's lives.